Hello. I just finished reading this book today, The Liberty Amendments, Restoring the American Public by Mark R. Levin. I highly recommend this book. I'm giving a review right now. I'm not reading it word for word. That would violate the copyright. In the first chapter, he gives a summary of the problem America is in. He uses the word post-constitutional because there are so many things going on now that are violations of the Constitution. And there have been a couple of the constitutional amendments that changed, that should be repealed, that were bad ideas that have changed things. There have been some bad court rulings. There have been some things that the Founding Fathers did not write into the Constitution explicitly, but in their other writings you can see they were thinking a certain thing, and the culture of the country at the time of the Constitution and for decades after exhibited certain traits. It's called the Liberty Amendments because he's got specific proposals for constitutional amendments that will help America with some of our problems. And one of the things he points out in the first chapter, our Founding Fathers wisely put into the Constitution a way to amend the Constitution without going through the Congress, or without Congress doing it. The Founders put that in there just in case we ended up with a corrupt Congress that would not try to reform itself, that would not make amendments that needed to be made. And we have that now, don't we? We really have that. So, to correct the problem, the Founding Fathers put that into the Constitution. So if things got really bad, we would still have that option to turn to, and hopefully avoid a massive civil war, which would result in the shedding of much blood. Or at least the Founding Fathers, when they were talking about that part of the Constitution, were trying to give us an option instead of going to war against the corrupt government, and that is to have the way to make constitutional amendments without having the Congress do it is 2/3 of the states need to call for a constitutional convention, and then in the convention amendments will be proposed which will still need 3/4 of the states to approve them. It's not we shouldn't be scared of it, of extremely bad ideas being implemented if we have a constitutional convention, because 3/4 of the states will have to approve those amendments, whatever results from the convention, and that should, hopefully 3/4 of the states will not approve really bad ideas. Alrighty, the chapters in this book are named after his name for the proposed amendment. So I'll read the chapter and give a brief summary. An amendment to establish term limits for members of Congress. Yep. This is an example of something that wasn't written into the Constitution, but it was there as a matter of culture and understanding at the start of the country. He cites the specific statistics. In the 1800s, the majority of congressmen only served a couple of terms, and they voluntarily stopped trying to run for Congress and went back home to their real jobs, where they got to suffer the results of their really bad ideas. Now congressmen stay in Congress until they get voted out and then get a job getting paid millions as a lobbyist, and they don't have to suffer into their bad ideas. They don't have to go try to find a real job in the economy that they have destroyed. an amendment to restore the Senate. It was a bad idea to have direct election of senators. It violates the principle of federalism. It was a good idea when we had the Senate that was put there by the legislature of the states thinking about the states, because the federal government is supposed to be created by the states and there to help the states. An amendment to establish term limits for Supreme Court justices and supermajority legislative override. One reason that the Founding Fathers gave life appointments to the Supreme Court justices is the Constitution does allow for their removal from office, their impeachment, but that has, I don't think it's ever happened in my lifetime, and it's been rare in the 1900s, if ever in the 1900s, which was part of my lifetime. They gave them these life appointments because they were only supposed to be ruling on cases and not making up bullcrap that's not in the Constitution. Not declaring constitutional acts unconstitutional. Not making up rights that are not in the Constitution. And so his proposal is give him 12 years, no second term. The judges will know that they've only got 12 years, won't need to worry about them trying to, well, they'll know they're gone anyway. Hopefully they would make good decisions, but if they don't, they would eventually be out anyway. But it gives the other part of this proposed amendment gives a supermajority legislative override. Right now, the only way to correct an incorrect Supreme Court decision is another Supreme Court decision or a constitutional amendment. That is too difficult. That's too much. It should not be that hard to correct 5 people, not 5 gods, 5 sinful, imperfect human beings' opinion about something. Especially when some of those opinions have a lot of impact. So his proposal is that a supermajority, I forget if this one was 3/5 or 2/3, but a vote of Congress that is a supermajority that's more than just 51 or just more than just one vote more than 50% would correct extremely bad Supreme Court decisions. Two amendments to limit federal spending and taxing. One problem our country has right now is an enormous deficit. An enormous debt. The deficit is what happens every year, spending more than you get. The debt is the accumulated deficits over time, and interest on money borrowed because of that bad spending. Right now, Congress does not have as much encouragements or being forced to control spending, to make tough decisions, to only fund constitutional programs like they will have if we implement this amendment, which puts limits on the spending that can happen, puts automatic spending cuts in everything if Congress doesn't do its job and come up with a budget, and also limits how high taxes can be. Taxes, one fact is, when taxes have gone up, when the tax rates have gone up, the budget deficits have not gone down, or they haven't been eliminated. So it's not just a matter of the tax rates. Well, and it's a fact that low tax rates can actually bring in more actual money than a high tax rate. But he doesn't point that out. That's something I'm adding, a fact of life. But so the problem that our country has with our deficit is not taxes being too low. We're looking at 50% taxes for the richest Americans. Well, rich is when you already have the money. 50% for those who are making the most money. There's not much more room to go up from there without being ridiculous. That kind of tax rate, if having a high tax rate would, and our corporate tax rate is higher than any other country in the world, if high tax rates would solve our deficit, we wouldn't have one now. So it's not going to cause a problem if you put a maximum tax rate, which is a lot lower than what is being paid now. And this one limits what new kinds of taxes can be created. Because the problem is not a lack of taxes. If it was, we wouldn't have a deficit with the current tax rates. An amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy. The legislature is where the legislative power is constitutionally. Unfortunately now there are a lot of federal bureaucracies that just make up a lot of rules. They're in fact legislating. Making up the rule is legislating. They're not just enforcing the rules that Congress votes on. This would... so that's one problem, and this amendment, I think, is a good way to address that problem, to force Congress to legislate, to prohibit the executive branch and bureaucracies that are supposed to only enforce the laws from writing new laws. An amendment to promote free enterprise is an attempt to get us back to where we were when the Constitution passed. The Commerce Clause of the Constitution has been horribly mangled by corrupt Supreme Court justices. It was in the 1940s that they came out with a ruling that said that anything that might affect commerce, anything that might affect interstate commerce, the Constitution gives the legislature power to regulate interstate commerce. The Supreme Court said that anything that might affect interstate commerce is constitutionally allowed. A law is affecting that. But that's not what the Constitution says. The specific case that the Supreme Court was ruling on was a man who wanted to grow wheat on his own property that he was not going to send across state lines. He was going to save some to replant the next year. He was going to use some for his own bread. He had some livestock he was going to feed with it. None of it was planning to cross state lines, but the Supreme Court said, well, that's going to affect if he's going to buy other things. And so it's interstate commerce. Because it affects if he buys them, that affects whether he'll buy it from across the state lines. That's not what the Commerce Clause is about. That's not what the Constitution says. That's not what the Founding Fathers intended. That's not what the clauses in the Constitution mean. And this amendment that he proposes will work on that problem. An amendment to protect private property. One thing he's worried about, which is completely reasonable for him to worry about, is the de facto taking of property, but without actually taking it on paper. Of course, de facto means what actually happens, even if the paper doesn't technically say it. For example, if you make a tax on something that's extremely expensive, or you do something that makes something extremely expensive, it is a de facto tax on a poor person owning that object, even though technically the law does not say a poor person is banned from owning whatever the object is that is being taxed. That's what de facto means. Well, if you control somebody's property in too much of a degree, that is a de facto seizing, and is proposing a remedy for that problem. An amendment to grant the states authority to directly amend the Constitution. Alright. This one is basically beefing up that clause that's already there that lets the states call for a constitutional convention. It still keeps the same limit on craziness that you have to get 3/4 of the states to approve an amendment, and it puts a time period on it, so you can't have like 50 years later, something finally gets approved by enough states. And that's, let's see, amendments authority directly amend. Let's see. And one thing to be pointed out real quickly, he does not think humans are imperfect or that the states are perfect, but that having the states have more power, what the Constitution intends, of course minus those important corrections that were made by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which he is in favor of. Those amendments were passed before he was born. I'm not sure about the 15th, but 13th and 14th were definitely passed before he was born, but he thinks that they were a good idea. But other than that, the powers the states were intended by the Constitution is what he's arguing for. And so giving these states more power to affect what the Constitution says is one way that we can honor that fact and put that power back into the states that should be there. Let's see, that is there in the Constitution for the states, even if the Constitution is being ignored by corrupt judges. An amendment to grant the states authority to check Congress. Yes. That proposed amendment, just puts one more check, one more balance of power against Congress, so Congress is limited on how bad of ideas they can do. It specifically would let a certain large majority of the state legislatures override regulations or regulations and laws that are a really bad idea. Which is federalism, which is giving the states their proper and constitutional power. That's the kind of power that is intended or implied to the states by the Constitution and the writings of the Founding Fathers. And one important thing to note, the big debate at the time of the Constitution was not, the people were not debating about what power the federal government and the state should have. The debate was just about whether the Constitution was going to go too far or whether the Constitution was going to set up a scenario that would be manipulated years later to violate what everyone was agreed to at that time about the states' rights and limiting the federal government power. The grand finale is not really correcting a problem of the government misbehaving, but it's just a fact now that it's too easy to commit voter fraud in the United States of America right now. And we're supposed to have a representative republic. It's important for people to trust, and trust because they have reason to trust, not trust because they're delusional. It's important for people to have trust that the election results are that way because that's the way the people, the legal, legitimate voters, only voting once and voting close to election day when they had a chance to hear all the arguments for and against the candidates and ideas, voted. And so this is a constitutional amendment proposal that would help us to have confidence that the results of an election are that way because legal, legitimate voters voted only once in that election and voted a reasonable closeness to the time of election day. It's trying to restore the concept of election day, which is violated by extreme early voting. We should have one day that is election day, so that everyone is hearing all the arguments right up until that day. Unless somebody's got a real legitimate need for a absentee ballot, we should bend over backwards to help those who are serving us in the military vote. Somebody who knows they're going to be on a business trip. We shouldn't bend over backwards, but we should accommodate somebody like that with an absentee ballot. But some people want to vote by mail, or some people are in favor of voting by mail because they're planning on committing the voter fraud, because their party is dependent on voter fraud. But people should actually go to a polling station. And no person with working brain cells is scared away from voting. If they need to carry with them to the voting booth the same thing they need to have with them to get money from their bank, to go into a federal building, to be near an important public official protected by the Secret Service, to rent a movie, to cash a check, to get on an airplane. Alright. So, thank you for watching this. I encourage everyone to buy and read this book, The Liberty Amendments, Restoring the American Public, by a very intelligent man, Mark R. Levin. Have a good day.